Hello everybody, I'm Silly. This will be part 10, chapter 10 of Susurrus of the Subdued, SOS. A cool breeze blew through the boy's curls, pushing them off to the side like small, curly waves of green. The wind whipped against his ears, whistling softly. Viridian eyes followed the sea of long grass, each breeze creating a line of ducked plants that flowed from one side of the field to the next. Cooing from nearby birds was the only thing to join the noise, harmonizing with the zephyr and calming his nerves. The boy looked across the field slowly, eyes drifting from left to right. It was empty aside from the nature that resided in the area. He could feel a slight pull that seemed to urge him forwards and into the open field. It tugged him, trying to get the boy to move forwards, and although he didn't understand why, he allowed it to pull him. His feet moved, taking his small body through the forest of tall grass with an unknown purpose. He kept his head on a swivel, looking around for whatever his brain had the drive to find. He had no idea what he was supposed to see, what he was looking for, but he wanted to satisfy the yearning sounding out in the back of his head. His knees bent as he hiked up the small hill that was once hidden within the sea of ferns in front of him. His thought process was that if he could get to a higher point, he might be able to see what his mind was after. He trudged up the hill, letting out small huffs of air through his mouth with each step. Sure, the mound wasn't too steep, but it still took an amount of effort from the child to make it to the zenith. Once he made it, it didn't take him too long to spot what his brain longed for. A small spot of dark green stood out in the field of lime. The figure had long green hair that was tied up in a small bun. She was wearing a pink sweater and navy blue skirt. His mother, the boy's mind soon registered, and it didn't take long for his heart to speed up in excitement. His lips turned up into a smile, and he raised his hands, cupping them over his mouth. "Mom!" he called out, hoping to catch the woman's attention. However, she didn't even so much as twitch at his yell. She must not have heard him. Taking in a deep breath, the boy tried again. "Mom!" She still didn't acknowledge him. Frowning, the boy glanced down the hill. He took in the steepness before beginning to make his way down the slope and towards the woman. "Mom?" the child asked, voice much quieter than it was previously. This time, though, he didn't expect a response, and neither did he get one. He kept approaching her, heart beating quickly from uncertainty rather than happiness. The closer he got, the clammier his skin grew. The ground beneath him seemed to morph, his feet getting trapped in it further with each step. Not to mention, the forest around him seemed to move in towards him, getting smaller with each movement he made. When his mother was within his grasp, the boy let his gaze fall to her wrist. Her back was turned to him, the lady not giving him any sort of attention. The child stared at her wrist, an odd feeling in his gut, and he only hesitated for a moment before he reached his bare hand out, grabbing it. "Mom, are you—" he started to say while looking up at her, only for his words to trail off. His whole body stilled, filling with a mix of fear and dread. What his eyes laid upon was not his mother, but a man with piercing yellow eyes, a black surgical mask, and short brown hair, glaring down at him with nothing more than disgust. The child recoiled, hand letting the man go, and feet attempting to yank up from the captivating ground. However, he remained trapped, even as the villain turned to face him fully. The boy's breath picked up, his heart beat painfully quick in his chest. The man, Overhaul, he was taking off his glove. The memory of red-hot pain shot through the child's mind, only serving to make his panic rise. The guy's hand reached forwards, towards his head, and the boy flinched. He raised his bandaged arms, trying to shield himself from the quirk coming his way. He couldn't move. He was stuck. It couldn't escape. A familiar pain shot through his arms as the villain's bare hand brushed against him. And, in an instant, Izuku's eyes shot open. He pushed himself up, a twinge of pain shooting up his right arm. Teary Viridian eyes darted around the room, taking it in. It was dark, save for a small light near the door. He was still in the bed he had fallen asleep in the night previous, the only thing different being the sheets. They were in a tangled mound at his feet, likely from being kicked off in his sleep. His lungs expanded and deflated at a rapid rate, heart beating quickly with adrenaline as its drive. Izuku's hands tightened in the sheets below him, causing pain to throb out of his right wrist. Why did it hurt? The child's breath hitched, but he quickly allowed it to stutter out in a slight wheeze. He needed to try and regulate his breathing. Passing out wouldn't do him any good. After all, falling asleep is the reason he experienced the disturbing imagery of being dismantled again. He wanted to turn back to look at his arm, as it was the place that the man's hand had brushed over, but the fear in his mind was chaining him down, making it so that he couldn't move. His brain was screaming at him to just look, but the terror the nightmare had provided him had the child in a chokehold, its grip white-knuckled and practically strangling him. The boy screwed his eyes shut, forcing the tears on his waterline to roll down his cheeks in small rivers. Izuku knew the fear he was experiencing was irrational. After all, Overhaul wasn't in the room. However, he knew the kind of pain he went through in his dream could happen, and that knowledge alone made the line between reality and fiction become blurred. He didn't know if what happened just moments ago was fake or not. Izuku's breath caught before it was huffed out and quickly inhaled. He knew that at least one of his arms was hurting, therefore he knew that he could at least feel them. Maybe he's fine? However, the boy knew Overhaul's quirk, so what's to say the boy's not experiencing phantom pains? His thoughts only continued to spiral in the dimly lit room, panic increasing by the second. The child panted harshly through his mouth, eyes reopening in what could only be desperation. He felt like he couldn't breathe. The sound of a lock unlatching sounded out to the right of the child, ringing out through the room loudly. His eyes and head snapped to the side, watching with nothing more than terror as the door cracked open. Light filtered into the room, causing pain Izuku didn't even realize was present in his head to bloom. However, when piercing yellow met dark viridian, the pain in his body was completely ignored. The child's breath completely stopped as he looked at the man from his nightmare. The man who Deku's pretty sure not only killed him, but revived him within seconds the day prior. Overhaul looked down at the child as he stalked closer, a man with a white mask replacing his spot in the door frame. The child's body trembled, but he couldn't look away. Izuku needed to calm down. He needed to run. However, the imaginary chains that seemed to hold him down were far too heavy to move. The child could only watch in pure fear as death itself came for him. Overhaul lifted up a book after stopping in front of the child, seemingly uncaring for his fear. I've taken a look at your notes, Midoriya. Izuku flinched minutely at the mention of his family name, memories of his mother flashing through his head. The older man's eyes narrowed at the movement, but he didn't comment, allowing Deku the moment needed to fully register the implications of what he said. The green child cautiously teared his eyes off the yellow ones, turning his gaze to lay upon the familiar notebook in the man's gloved hand. He regarded the words on the front cover with a sense of familiarity. It was the one thing Izuku had recognized in the last 24 hours, and his mind immediately latched onto the item's sense of safety. His breathing slowly started again now that the child had something grounding in his presence. As long as he only focused on the journal, he could keep himself from panicking. Overhaul brought his other hand up, shifting it in order to begin flipping through the pages. They're quite useful. He spoke up carefully, and something in his voice told Izuku there was more to what that statement meant. Tell me something, Midoriya. The child twitched, eyes darting to the man's hands before his face. His features were mostly hidden by the gold and brown mask he wore, but his narrowed eyes were visible. A shiver crawled down from the back of Deku's scalp, shooting down his spine. He could feel that his heartbeat was still quick, and the boy chose to focus on the feeling of it slamming against his ribs and lungs, rather than the deepening feeling of unease. Why did you put so much effort into these just to sell them off? The guy inquired, turning the book so that Izuku could look at the pages rather than the cover. The boy's eyes flew over the page, more so looking at the words rather than actually reading them. He then swallowed down the lump in his throat, dry lips parting while his gaze simultaneously shifted to the older person. I wanted to help people. His voice was rough, most likely from the several times he's cried in the last few hours. Deku wasn't going to tell this man the full truth. After all, going off what he said, he has tabs on the green-haired child's mother. The room was silent for a moment, the atmosphere growing thick while the bile in Izuku's esophagus grew. He doesn't like looking at the villain. Overhaul was regarding him with an almost warning look as he slowly crouched down to be level with the child in front of him. Said kid couldn't help but recoil a bit, memories of the last time the man was eye level with him flying to the front of his mind. Since you want to help people, why don't you help me? The man said, placing the book on the bed in front of Izuku. What? The child choked out, unbelieving of the words that left Overhaul's mouth. I want you to record data on a hero for me. No! Izuku quickly said, only to immediately regret it. His body grew stiff, his gaze filling with nothing but terror. The last thing he wanted to do was piss the villain off. However, the man's gaze didn't change. Care to explain? Deku's throat tightened, eyes blinking away tears. He needed to talk, but his voice felt like it was being suffocated by the lump in his throat. Deku swallowed roughly. If he didn't respond, something told the boy that Overhaul's hands and quirk wouldn't remain sealed. I can't help a villain. But you've already helped several. What's one more? Izuku's whole world stopped. Clarity filled Deku's mind as all the questions about his clients simultaneously came to the forefront of his mind and were answered. Ever since the meeting with Inaba, he knew that something was off with the people he helped. However, he never paid that feeling any mind due to the fact he was not only being appreciated, but for once in his life, was useful. Amidst Deku's reeling, Overhaul raised a brow. You're a smart kid, yet you never did figure it out, did you? The man paused, standing. Or you just chose to ignore it. Whatever the case may be, I need you to do this. This hero's getting too close to discovering things I'd rather keep to myself. You understand the feeling, right? Wanting to keep something to yourself. The green boy's quirk status came to mind, but he said nothing. So do me a favor, Deku, and write one more analysis. Izuku shook his head, determination still sparking within his soul, despite knowing what the consequences could be. I can't, he choked out. You don't have a choice, Midoriya. The villain all but snapped. Izuku flinched, head shooting up to finally look the man in the eyes once more. I can't! That'd be hurting heroes. You're a villain. The backbone the boy once had was torn from his spine the moment Overhaul's hands moved together. Izuku's eyes blew wide, and he quickly stood up on the other side of the bed. He shifted back, knees almost giving out from the fatigue his body still felt. The boy expected Death to move forwards, to brush against him once again. But Overhaul made no move to get closer. It was silent in the room for what felt like hours, the only sound filtering into Izuku's ears being that of his own wheezes of terror. "I will bring you a notebook and computer, and you will do what I want, or I will not hesitate to dirty my hands. Is that clear, child?" Overhaul said, voice full of nothing but the promise of suffering. Deku only hesitated for a moment, fear snuffing out the flame that once burned in him, before he stiffly nodded. The villain regarded him for only a moment longer before he was turning to exit the room, still gloved hands separating. Once he reached the door, however, he paused next to the man standing in the door frame. "Fix the bandages on his arm before you send him off." The employee nodded, trading places with his boss as he entered the room and Overhaul left it. The man was tall, dressed in an all-black samurai robe. He had a calm but commanding demeanor, eyes relaxed but alert. His bird mask, a pattern the child has seen throughout the people that worked for Overhaul, was more muzzle-like, the leather brown and wrapped around his head. Although it only covered the lower half of his face, leaving his eyes and blonde hair visible. His blonde hair reminded Izuku of his childhood friend, and his heart pinched. He shut the door behind him, turning the light on by a switch that sat by the exit of the room. Izuku's eyes were forced to shut from the light, head swimming as another stronger wave of pain shot through his head. The boy all but collapsed to the bed as his knees gave out from the fatigue coursing through his body. He took a moment to adjust to the ache in his skull, distantly hearing the other occupant of the room unlocking one of the cabinets. The man shuffled around the room while Izuku sat in agony, and eventually, the boy felt the bed dip next to him. His eyes shot open, the pain in his head doubling. However, he ignored it in favor of shifting back from the man next to him. The villain looked at him for a moment, eyes calm amongst the storm in the child's mind. He then held out both of his hands, and reluctantly, Izuku's gaze drifted to them. In his left was a roll of bandages, matching the one on the boy's arm, gauze, and antiseptic wipes. His right was completely empty, and Izuku got the feeling that the man was silently asking for his arm. Izuku stared at it for only a moment before hesitatingly reaching his right arm out, allowing it to hover over his hand. The villain took the appendage gingerly, turning it over in his palm in order to see the loosened edge. Izuku had been watching carefully up to that moment, but as the wrap began to be pulled off, his eyes squeezed shut. The boy's head turned to the side while he began to fight the urge to vomit. He didn't want to see if there was more of that scar, the stitches. He didn't want to know what else was done to him. Around an hour later, Izuku was ushered into a different room by one of the workers in the compound. It was mostly empty, aside from an old computer and a few filled to the brim bookshelves. The area was almost suffocating him as he remained in its presence. However, he knew he had no choice in the matter of his task. Sitting down, the child was given a black notebook the size of his old one, but in all honesty, it felt more like he was being handed the knife instead. Deku knew what writing information down meant, what it would do. But he also knew what was at stake. His mother, and possibly his own life. But was he really ready to go through with helping a villain? Overhaul's words buzzed in his ears distantly. He already did help villains. How much data has Deku sold to people, only for that information to be turned on the hero involved? How many people did he hurt? The worker next to him tapped the book's cover, bringing Izuku's attention back to the world around him. Viridian eyes took in the void-like cover for a moment before his gaze flicked up to the man next to him, who was dressed in an all-white cloak. It was similar to Nomoto's clothing, but his had sleeves that reached his wrists. His hood was up, shadowing the mask that covered his face. The bird-like face covering was similar to Overhaul's in its gold and brown coloring. However, his covered his whole face rather than just his nose and mouth. He was most likely the closest one to his boss. "The faster you get this done, the faster you can go back to your room and rest, Midoriya," he said with a rather friendly tone for the circumstances. However, there was still a firmness to his voice. Izuku swallowed, looking at him for a long moment. He couldn't tell the expression of the person, but he hoped for once someone wasn't glaring at him. The man tapped his index finger on the book once more, bringing the boy's attention back to it. It only took a moment before Deku's shaking hand reached out, opening the pages. As the boy wrote, minutes dragged on to hours as he became immersed in his analysis. By focusing on the data, the boy didn't have to think about what was going on around him. Sure, he wanted to know what was going on, but in all reality, his body was screaming for some sort of break from all the stress. And Izuku was going to take any sort of rest he could get. Both his eyes and arms hurt the more time went on, though. His eyes were in pain from looking at a screen with a lingering headache, but his arm was something of itself altogether. Each time Deku applied pressure to the pencil to make a mark on the page below, pain shot through his wrist. It was most likely due to the wound that lay under his fixed bandages. The lost muscle was most likely making the weight distribution in his arm to be offset. Furthermore, there was probably something wrong with his nerves. The blade did go sideways, after all. Izuku shook his head, purging the thought from his brain. He took a breath through his nose, the nostrils not whistling like they are supposed to. That was something the boy had noticed since being killed. He could breathe easier. The pain in his left leg was gone too. He wasn't sure why, but in all honesty, he wishes it was never fixed. His nose and leg being mended was just one of the many reminders of what happened yesterday. Deku shook his head once more, eyes shooting up to the monitor in front of him. The system was old, but seemed to work better than the one he owned at home. At some point, Izuku had thought of using it to reach out to someone on the outside, but ruled it out by the feeling of eyes on the back of his head. He could think of something eventually, but right now he just wanted to get his death notes over with. His eyes scanned across the information on screen. Soon after, he was back to writing data down, hands shaking lightly. It was the final sentence he needed to complete the page. The closer he got, though, the worse the guilt in his gut became. It felt like the child was slowly drowning, being dragged under the tides of remorse by white-gloved hands that trapped him in an iron grip. His chest tightened, throat closing up. Time seemed to stretch the closer he got to the dooming period at the end of his words. And he was regretting his aid more and more by the second. Eventually, though, Izuku had to press the lead down to place a dot on the page. He hesitatingly looked at his pencil for a moment before leaning up. He sniffled, bandaged hand coming up to press his palm against his eye. He slid it off to the side, and when he pulled down his hand, it came back wet, white bandage darkened with tears. The villain behind him, noticing that the boy wasn't going to continue writing, pushed off the wall with a bone-deep sigh. He walked over, looking down at the shaking child before the book. His hand reached out, scooping it up while shutting it. "Come on," the man said gruffly, tapping the book against Izuku's shoulder. It took the child only a moment to collect himself before he could fully stand. Once he did, the man in white was leading him out of the room, keeping the journal under his arm. It was mostly silent as they walked, as by this point, Izuku had stopped crying. The only thing reminding the child of his agony being his tight eyes that were most likely red, and his stuffy nose. Every now and then, the hallway was filled with the sound of him sniffling up snot that threatened to run down his face. Izuku was tired. As they walked, the boys still paid attention, though. After all, in a place like this, rest was something that was teased. It was something that he had to keep alert during, and that in turn just exhausted him more. Therefore, he could never fully let that fatigue heal. This place was like Aldera in that sense, although in all honesty, the child would rather be there than this compound. As they came to a crossway of two hallways, the same ones they had come down before, the worker next to him had guided them to the right rather than the left. Izuku glanced back at the hallway they didn't turn down, confusion making its way onto his reddened face. The child had been keeping track of what pathways they had been taking, marking it by small spots on the wall or the directions of the pipes on the ceiling. He had started doing it the moment he was let out of the room he rested in after he noticed the blankness of the walls. It had been a smart move in the end due to the fact that the facility was practically a maze. The way they went down, though, wasn't going towards the room he was staying in. Deku's mind began to race, coming up with different possibilities. Maybe he was just being led to a different room, or being allowed to shower? Off of what Izuku had gotten off of Overhaul, he didn't like messes, so that conclusion couldn't be that far off. However, as they came to a stop in front of an open door, the possibility the child didn't want to admit could be there crushed him with its weight. Inside the room stood Overhaul, preparing things to the right of the looming chair. The chair was all too familiar to the boy, causing the memory of hot pain to shoot up his right arm. Terror ran through his veins, and without a second thought, Izuku turned. His feet pushed off the ground harshly before he could stop them, and before he knew it, he was running down the hallway. The worker that had been next to him yelled, most likely for Deku to stop or for more employees to come after him. But he didn't care. Izuku couldn't go back to that chair again. He turned down hallway after hallway, not keeping track of where he was going anymore. He didn't have time, and not a plan in sight. All the boy was thinking about was the feeling of the blade in his arm. His skin felt tight, the sound of people chasing him too loud. The child wanted to scream, to puke, or to cry, but his hyperventilating prevented him from doing so. In all honesty, he was surprised he was even able to run. As he turned down another hallway, he glanced back, noting Nemoto and the man from before chasing after him. A shiver shot down his back, and he quickly tore his eyes off of them. However, as his face turned, his legs collided with something small. He tripped, and without thinking, he reached his hands out to catch himself. The ache in his right arm spiked immediately as his palm slammed against the ground. His eyes screwed shut, tears leaking out of them as he whimpered. He rolled to the ground, and the boy's uninjured hand reached, grabbing his other arm lightly while he curled up on his side. That really hurt, kid. The thing that he collided with spoke up, stalking closer. Izuku's eyes peeked open despite the pain. The person walking closer to him was short and almost doll-like in their appearance. They had a hand on their head, rubbing it like they were in pain. Izuku's brows pinched together. He knew he needed to get up, but the pain in his body was too much. He was far too tired, his adrenaline running low. Furthermore, the hallway he was in was a dead end, the only exit being where the doll man was standing. That begs the question, though. How did they get here if it was a dead end? As both Nomoto and the man from the computer room rounded the corner, all of the ache in the boy's body was pushed aside. They had surveyed the scene, watching as the child tried to stand, and had deemed it maintained. Midoriya, the one dressed in white, spoke up, walking over slowly. Running's only gonna make it worse. He tried to reach out and grab the boy, but Izuku swiftly snapped his unscathed arm out, smacking the man's hand away. He pushed himself up enough so he could at least move himself by the back of his heels. It was similar to when he was kidnapped. He was cornered. I warned you what would happen if you didn't listen, Midoriya. A low voice said as it entered the space. Izuku's whole body stilled, and he immediately recalled why he wasn't supposed to fight back. Viridian darted up to meet Yellow, and the child began to shake. Overhaul was glaring at him, forehead and arms blistering. He was stalking closer, death being released as his glove was removed off of his right hand. But seeing as you're still learning, you could take the punishment for your mother. Wait, I'm sorry. The boy didn't get to finish before the villain's hand made contact. Izuku's whole body burned with nothing but pain. This time seemed longer than the last. The pain far worse. And even as he blinked wide and terrified eyes open, he could only stare at the floor and shake. The pain was still a phantom, sweeping over his trembling form and running against his nerves. He could distantly hear the sound of Overhaul speaking, but tuned it out just as quickly as it filtered through his ears. The child didn't want to hear it. The familiar pain in his body already too loud enough. He was eventually grabbed by his arms on both sides and lifted. However, the pain that those hands caused him was too much to fully register. His nerves felt stripped, and anything that brushed against him burned. It was familiar, and he hated it. Izuku hated that the feeling of death had become something he knew, and that he could recognize the cold yellow eyes that accompanied it. Death's eyes weren't caring, they weren't loving, and they sure as hell didn't have mercy. And for that, the child would never look at the color the same again. Izuku hated yellow. Alright everybody, that concludes Part 10, Chapter 10 of Susurrus of the Subdued, SOS. Please make sure to check out the Discord if you haven't already. If you would like to get updates easier, get connected with people within the fanfiction community, make requests for a podfic, and more. The link to the server will be in the description. Now, I hope you enjoyed, and thank you for listening.